Mason wanted to say hi again. My costume for today is Darth Vader. Hello everybody and welcome back to my channel. My name is Jarrett and we are going to be continuing our discussion about Dead Like Me. Oh man, taken a whole year and there were a lot of bumps in the road to get here, but finally what I set out to do in October of 2019, here we are in October of 2020 finally finishing it. And it is officially Halloween. I've wiped the tears from my eyes and I am ready to talk about this episode. So we are on the final episode, which is episode 15 of season 2. This episode is called Haunted. This episode is a Halloween themed episode, and I think it is probably one of the most beautiful endings of any television show ever. The reason why I love this show so much overall is, one, because it's funny. It's a very interesting, unique take on Grim Reapers, and I love the dark comedy aspect. I love how irreverent it is. Everything about this show I think is wonderful, but what I really appreciate about it is this ending and how many layers are in it. I can't stop saying good things about this show. I'm very excited that I was able to, get through this project. I finally stuck to something. But without further ado, let's talk about the episode. Now that we're 6 minutes in, what am I, some beauty blogger now? Talking for 10 minutes before I actually start the product review. I don't know if the producers knew that they were not getting renewed when they made this episode, but if they didn't, it's a wonderful farewell, and I always violently sob at the end, but we're gonna get there. So I kind of want to just talk about the episode as a whole. Normally I kind of break it up by characters. So we start out the episode and Georgia is talking about how she loved Halloween as a kid, but the thing that she loves the most was getting to look in people's houses and getting to snoop. And we know that Georgia loves to kind of get into places that she's not supposed to be at. We kind of start out in Der Waffle House, where this ongoing story of Mason living with Daisy and George is kind of coming to a head, and they're frustrated that Mason is just walking around in the nude, and they tell him that he can't do it anymore. And George is like, you need to start pulling your weight, which is understandable, because if you have a roommate who is not paying rent or not contributing to groceries and just eating your food and being vile and disgusting all the time, you're gonna want them to do something. So Mason, says that he'll bring in all of this candy. They'll have a year's supply. And he starts out by stealing candy from children, which Rube comments it's challenging for him. And George agrees to go on this quest with him throughout the day to go and get all this candy. But before this happens, she notes that Rube is acting strange. Mason mentions that on Halloween, the dead will appear as they were when they were alive, and Rube tries to offer George a mask so that she can cover herself, but she doesn't really want to. She says that the strings are gonna mess with her hair, and Rube doesn't really fight her on it. And he goes to leave. He gets his food to go, and he bounces. And Rube's still really sad about what happened with Rosie, understandably. And when George goes up to him and asks him what's stopping her from just going up to her old house and asking for a Kit Kat from her sister, Rube just says, what is stopping you? Because Rube's broken the first rule that he sets, which is don't pursue your old life. Rube went after his daughter. He pursued her, he found her, he was there when she died. He broke the rule. How can he possibly enforce this rule to any of the other Reapers? But also, he's in a state of depression right now, and he's very sad about what happened. And now he's finally connecting with this loss, and it's making it hard for him to be the leader that he was. He just can't be that person anymore. George is sad that Rube is different. And she makes a comment that he's the paternal one, and he says, well, paternal didn't really work out that well for me. Which is doubly sad when you realize that he's not only talking about being a leader for the group, but also just being a dad, that he had to watch his daughter die. Which is sad, it's very sad. But then we get something very interesting because Tiffany comes around and says that Roxy is the mother, which I think is fantastic, but she says because Roxy reminds her of her mother. But the thing is that the Reapers are appearing as they did when they were alive, and Tiffany does not seem to be fazed that they all look slightly different, because we've seen what Millie looks like, and she doesn't look anything like Georgia. And we've seen what Mason looks like, and he doesn't look anything like the Mason that we see. So the fact that Tiffany is completely unfazed by what should be a massive transformation is almost a little more telling and kind of lends to this idea that Tiffany might also be a Reaper and just doesn't tell anybody. Maybe she's for another division and Rube just doesn't know. Maybe she's a part of Plague Division. That could be a fun twist. And anyway, she's just not phased, which I think is fascinating. Mason and George go to Happy Time so that George can get her running shoes to help get her through the day. And they bump into Crystal there, who's got this map of all of the prime trick-or-treating locations and places where you can get the best candy. But she recognizes George as Millie, but as soon as they leave, she looks up George Alas on the computer. And I wonder if that maybe Crystal has always been aware that Millie is George, and it just didn't really set until this day where she saw her as a different person. That she recognized her as Millie in some sense. She kind of had an idea it was her. Maybe it's like when you use cloaking devices in video games, that you're kind of invisible, but when you're moving around, maybe it's not as effective. Maybe Georgia appears as she did when she's still, but when she's moving around, maybe the illusion is shattered a bit and it goes in between George and Millie. And maybe Crystal could kind of see Millie for a second, but then as soon as Georgia stopped, she became George. Maybe it's something similar to that. When Joy and Reggie are talking together, Reggie is really digging into this idea that George is a ghost and is walking around and that she could be out there somewhere, and Joy is going to take her back to therapy. And we saw in the last episode that she was already considering bringing Reggie back to therapy, but now we actually see it happen when she gets there. Joy's not really letting the process happen the way that it's supposed to, but also I would argue that this therapist is not very good, because the way that they were approaching everything and the way they were tackling things was not the most sensitive, in my opinion. I feel like this was a therapist who was getting paid a lot of money, because Joy comments that she's paying over $160 for this therapy appointment, but I don't think she's really getting her money's worth. This therapist, she sends Reggie away and she tells Joy, you know, you have to let this happen organically. And Joy says that she doesn't think that therapy is going to bring back her daughter. And in one light, you can glean that she's maybe talking about Reggie, that she's trying to get this kind of sense of her daughter back and out of this pit of sadness and depression that Reggie's in. But on the other sense, you can maybe glean that maybe for herself, she's trying to get some type of closure with George, and she can't get it. And this is where the therapist actually does make a fairly good comment, where she says, which daughter are you trying to bring back? We get to meet Suzanne, one of their neighbors, and she's this fun, kooky white lady who is very zen and very much the type of lady who probably has sage burning in her home at all times and appropriates cultures that she shouldn't. Probably tries to do it sensitively, but just fails. You know, shops at Home Goods, and she's very much that type of lady. Suzanne is one of my favorite random neighbors that they just toss in. She's fun. For her very short appearance, she probably could have been a long-standing neighbor and been very fascinating to watch throughout the series. She invites Joy to a Dia de los Muertos party that she's throwing that night, and she tells Reggie a little bit about it, that it's a celebration of the dead, and it kind of sparks something for Reggie. Something that she hasn't really ever felt identified with before. Nobody's ever really seemed to connect with her. That she's just trying to remember George in a certain type of way, and that's what this celebration could be. But she obviously doesn't want to go. Parties aren't really her thing, so she decides to stay home while Joy goes. Meanwhile, the Reapers are doing their thing. They're going and getting their reaps, which I'll talk about in a little bit. I want to get to that last. But Roxy is dressed up in this really fierce princess dress, which inspires Daisy to get into costume too. So she gets into a police uniform. And while she's at their Waffle House, she gets her receipt and she says, you know, why doesn't she have to pay for her coffee? It's missing. And Tiffany walks by and just wink, wink, nudge, nudge, and is like, coffee's free for cops, which is such a fun little reference and nod to when Roxy first became a cop. And I love that they brought that moment full circle. While they're sitting there, Daisy is recognized by this old man who recognizes her as Daisy Adair, this old Hollywood starlet who died and gone with the wind. And she was always on the arm of some socialite. And we kind of get more confirmation in the last episode. I had talked about how there wasn't really much confirmation about Daisy's death, but this guy kind of solidifies that her story is true. But it's fascinating that he recognized her, and he was so disturbed by the fact that she was just sitting there in a police uniform, drinking coffee at their Waffle House. We get to see Dolores one last time, and she's dressed up in this really fun kitty cat costume, and she's leading a bunch of kids from some shelter and is helping them get candy. And we get to kind of say goodbye to Dolores. She unfortunately doesn't have a moment with Millie, which is understandable because she can't really see her, because if she does, she's gonna recognize her as George, not as Millie. And Dolores, has this interaction with Roxy. She has this really hilarious quote, and then we don't see Dolores again. So this is the last moment with her. There was a really fascinating moment where Reggie finally snaps at Joy and tells her that she always freaks out about things that don't matter. And we've always seen Reggie be so reserved and not really sharing her emotions or her feelings with Joy. And with therapy, that's what Joy was trying to get out of her. She was trying to get her to break down her walls. And finally, Reggie just kind of opened up, and it allowed them to kind of see each other in a way that they haven't before. And I think that's why when Reggie was like, okay, let's go to the cemetery, let's go hang out in the graveyard by George's headstone, Joy was hesitant, but she did it, and she stayed there overnight with Reggie, and it was such a sweet moment to see them laying there together in the cemetery. And Reggie kind of connects that George always ignored her when they went trick-or-treating. And I think there's a part of Reggie that wants to remember George as what she could have been. And maybe some of this sadness that she has over George's death is that relationship never became what it could have been. In the end, the Reapers have a ton of candy that Mason and George have collected. I don't know if it's necessarily a year's supply, but they have quite a bit, and they're sharing it, and Daisy can't trade away her black licorice, which is hilarious. And Rube asks for some peanut brittle and calls George Peanut for the last time, and she says, I'm not that girl, I'm not her anymore. And Rube's like, you're right, you're not, Peanut. And I think Rube is gonna continue to be kind of a fatherly figure to her. And Rube takes some flowers to the graveyard, and we see him for the very last time, because he doesn't appear in the movie. We see him one last time, and he brings some flowers to Rosie and Lucy's headstones. And this is the part where I start crying, and I'm gonna get into the last bit in just a second. So I wanna talk about the Reaps. The Reaps are all horrifying and tragic and sad and disturbing and awful. These are some of the worst moments in the entire series, I think right next to the Lunatic Massacre. We see this serial killer. This is the first time we've gotten one in the series. We've never really had one of these moments before. And this is theoretically a long-standing serial killer, because when George was a kid, she went to this house and this guy put candy outside. He didn't open his door, and she thought he was kind of a freak, and she recognized these tennis shoes that he wore. And this man, we see these tennis shoes throughout the entire episode. We don't see his face. We don't see his name. He has no name credit. And I'm getting goosebumps just talking about it. Like, literally my arms are covered in goosebumps. And he's responsible for all of the deaths this episode. And what I think is kind of tragically beautiful about each one of these Reaps is that each one of them kind of corresponds to something about the Reapers, something that has been kind of characteristically them throughout the entire series. So Rube gets this young girl who was left home alone, and her parents are off in Barbados discovering their youth again. This kind of ticks that box for Rube, because he's always been the parent to this little group of his. He's always had this kind of parent issue of not being able to properly take care of his daughter. And here are these parents that just left their kid alone. And I think that ticks a box for him. Daisy gets this older woman who has all these beautiful, elegant decorations outside of her home. And she's very opulent in her own way, and very extravagant in her own way, in the same way that Daisy is. And you can tell that this woman puts a lot of thought into the way that she presents herself. But when she's killed, she is this defenseless woman who's attacked. And that's something that Daisy doesn't do. That's something that ticks her box. Something that she doesn't like when women are getting attacked. And we saw that in the episode where the woman died in the hotel. For Mason, he gets this little boy who's stuck at home, and he can't go trick-or-treating because he's sick. And this ticks a little box for Mason because Mason is such a free spirit. He's always been that way. He's always been able to kind of just do whatever he wants. And here's this boy who literally can't do anything he wants on this day because he's sick. Mason gives him all of these candies and treats to try to help him feel better. It's very sad and it's very upsetting that this little boy died because it's sad that all these characters die because I think of what happens when their family comes home. It's very sad and tragic, but this little boy getting left home alone when he just wanted to go trick-or-treating and he can't, and Mason wanted to get all these snacks for the Reapers. He's kind of showing how selfless that he can be in giving these candies to this little boy. With Roxy, she gets this man who's giving out bourbon candies. Once he finds out that she's a cop, he's fully prepared to go down to the station with her and be arrested for giving out alcohol to minors. But Roxy gives him a free pass and she says, don't worry, there's not going to be any arrests today. And one, she knows that this guy is going to die and it would be senseless to take him out of that situation because she can't interfere with death. But this calls back to when she had her day in season 1 and she gave that guy a pass. He was supposed to get the parking ticket, but she gave him a free pass because it was one of those days. And for this guy, it was one of those days for him. And Roxy was having a terrible day. All the things that could have happened to her were happening. She was dealing with bags of flaming poop and a dead cat and people egging their Waffle House. But she gave this guy some grace and not arresting him. With George, this is the one that is the most... She covers up this guy's name. We never see what his name is. Her thumb is always over it. She knocks on the door and she tells him that it's over, implying that he's not going to be able to kill anybody again. But what's fascinating is that his house is full of gravelings and we see them running about in the background. Even when Georgia was a kid, we saw a graveling in this house. This man obviously has dark intentions and always has. He's probably getting whispered to by the gravelings about killing people and doing these dark things. But Georgia leaves him. She walks away. The door's left open. The gravelings close it. And George leaves. Georgia never leaves a soul. And she leaves him and she says, some souls are better left forgotten. The fact that she covered his name, that she walked away, and she crumpled his post-it, all says that she doesn't want anything to do with this guy. It's so opposite of what we normally see from her. But he was a genuinely awful guy. Maybe he deserved it. So in the very end of the episode, and this is where I just hysterically started crying, and I do every single year, George goes and visits Joy and Reggie at the graveyard, and they're laying there and they're asleep, sun's rising, and George says, I'm not sure if I'm supposed to visit them or just haunt them. And Reggie wakes up and sees her standing there, and George walks away and kind of just smirks at Reggie, and she walks away through the graveyard. And this is a callback to season 1 where they ended in a graveyard and Georgia running through it and talking about the flying Rolindas, how they were never afraid to take the leap. And here she is taking another big leap and walking through this graveyard. And the fact that they ended both seasons in a graveyard it's very beautifully written and directed and executed, and overall it's just wonderful. This episode I have quite a few favorite quotes because it's just overall such a good episode. It is arguably the best episode in the entire series. Yes, it's the best episode in the series. I had to think about it for like a second. The first one is from little Georgia, who says, it's Halloween, it's supposed to be disturbing, because it sets up the entire episode. It sets up what you're going to expect from this. The next one is from Daisy, and it's when Mason is stealing the candy, and Daisy says, Mason, don't bring kids near us. And that's how I feel all the time. Don't bring kids near me. The next one is from Roxy, and it's when Daisy asks what she's dressed up as, and she says, I'm Roxy, the badass witch of the Northwest. The next one is from Dolores, and it's where she says, liquor chocolates were my gateway drug. We know that Dolores had a drug problem, and it had to do with blow, but the fact that it started with liquor chocolates and went to cocaine is so hilarious. The next one comes from Joy, and it's when they're sitting in the graveyard, and she tells Reggie, and Suzanne smokes a lot of pot. And I don't know why it makes me giggle, but it does. This episode had quotes from pretty much all of my favorite people. That's the episode. I love it. This is a yearly tradition for me to watch it on Halloween every single year. I cry every single time because it's so beautifully done, and I'm very grateful to have been able to do this series, and thank you to everybody who's stuck around through all these episodes. I know it's been kind of a long journey, but we're finally there, and I think I'm going to tackle the Dead Like Me movie either tomorrow or the next day, so be looking out for that. But thank you so much for watching the series, and I will see you guys later. Bye.